Have the events of the book of Revelation already happened? That's what we're going to talk about, and it starts right now. Welcome and thanks for watching. I hope that you've subscribed to the channel. If not, please click the button and the bell so you don't miss out on any new content. Well, there are two primary ways to interpret the book of Revelation. There's the futurist view and there's the preterist view. What's the difference? Well, futurists believe that the events after chapter 4 of Revelation, which would include the tribulation, the second coming, the millennial reign, the great white throne judgment, the new heavens and the new earth, all of those are events yet future to our time. By contrast, the preterists believe that all or parts of the book of Revelation were fulfilled in the first century, with the events described between chapters 4 and 19 referring specifically to the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. So what that means is all the passages that futurists say are talking about the tribulation, that future 7-year period of judgment on the earth. The preterists say, no, that's actually referring to an historic event that occurred not long after the writing of Revelation, happened in AD 70 when the Romans invaded Jerusalem, leveled the city, and destroyed the Jewish temple. Now, why do preterists hold that view? Well, there are a number of reasons, but one of them undoubtedly is that many preterists come from a Reformed tradition. Reformed theologians generally don't see a distinction between Israel and the church. They reason Israel rejected the Messiah. After the events of AD 70, they were dispersed, scattered around the world. Therefore, it was inconceivable for a long time to imagine any literal fulfillment of prophecy concerning Israel. They were not a recognizable nation, nor were they even in the land. Well, all of that changed in 1948, when for the first time in 2,000 years, there was an official Jewish state. And where were they located? In the biblical land of Israel, showing that it is indeed possible for literal fulfillment of all prophecy regarding Israel. Despite this, preterists have stuck to their guns. Now, keep in mind one thing. If you believe that Revelation is talking about the invasion of Jerusalem by the Romans in AD 70, it's going to be very, very important where you have the date of writing for the book of Revelation. After all, if Revelation was written after AD 70, that renders your whole argument invalid. Now, there are two primary dates that are discussed for the writing of Revelation. The first is AD 65. This is the early date. It's also known as the Neronic date, as it puts Revelation's writing during the reign of the Roman Emperor Nero. The second date is AD 95. This is called the late date. It's also called the Domitianic date because it puts Revelation's writing during the reign of the Roman Emperor Domitian, who ruled from AD 81 to AD 96. Now, what you need to know is the AD 95 date, the late date, was the traditional accepted date for the writing of Revelation for 1900 years. Now, if the traditional late date of AD 95 is correct, that means that all forms of the preterist interpretation of Revelation are completely invalidated. It literally destroys the argument that Revelation is talking about an event that happened in the first century, because Revelation would then have been written 25 years after that event actually happened. Now, while many futurists do hold to the late date of AD 95 for the writing of Revelation, their view is not dependent on that date. In fact, there are some futurists who hold to the early date of writing. It really doesn't matter when Revelation was written as it pertains to the futurist view. The futurist simply believes that all of the events of Revelation are yet future to our time, regardless of whether it was written in AD 65 or AD 95. If we hold to an AD 95 date, it's simply because there is historical support for that date. But it is absolutely essential, if you're a preterist, that Revelation be written prior to AD 70. If it was written later, that would be fatal to your entire viewpoint. Now, this video is not going to be an exhaustive discussion on this matter, but I did want to address three primary arguments that preterists often make as to why they believe, based on the text, they say, that Revelation was written before the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. Argument number one is there is no mention of the destruction of Jerusalem in Revelation. Now, the idea behind that argument is that the destruction of Jerusalem was such a momentous event, it's inconceivable that John would not mention it in Revelation. My response to that argument is, first of all, that one must consider John's initial audience. These are Gentiles. Think about it. The book starts with 7 letters to the 7 churches of where? Asia Minor. That means they're Gentiles. And if they're living in AD 95, then the destruction of Jerusalem happened 25 years in the past. It is irrelevant for John to mention this event that occurred so long ago in a land 800 miles away, and there would be no need to reference that because they would have no connection to it culturally, ethnically, chronologically, or geographically. Also, one must consider the nature of Revelation as a prophetic book. Revelation is not a history book. It's not got the purpose of talking about things that have happened. It's talking about things that are going to happen. It's described as a prophecy from the very beginning. In Revelation 1:3, it says, "Blessed is the one who reads aloud the words of this prophecy. And blessed are those who hear and keep what's written in it, for the time is near." So the prophetic nature of this book is asserted at the very beginning of the book and also at the very end. Revelation 22:7 says, "And behold, I'm coming soon. Blessed is the one who keeps the words of the prophecy of this book." So we're dealing with a book that is not concerned with events of the past, but with events of the future. Argument number 2 is that there's no mention in Revelation of Jesus' prophecy of the destruction of Jerusalem having been fulfilled. We read in Matthew 24, verse 2, "But he answered them, You see all these, do you not? Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." So the idea of this argument is that Jesus prophesied in Matthew 24 that the temple would be destroyed. If that had already happened by the time of Revelation, the preterists say it would be inconceivable for John to fail to mention the fulfillment of that prophecy. In the New Testament, we see writers constantly going out of their way to point out that prophecy had been fulfilled. There's a phrase that pops up frequently that says, "This was to fulfill what the prophet spoke." And the purpose of highlighting fulfilled prophecy was to assert the divine origin of the Bible as opposed to its human origin. And so they say it's impossible that John would not mention this if Jesus' prophecy had been fulfilled by this point. Well, here's my response to that argument. First of all, the fulfillment formula is never used in Revelation for any prophecy. The Bible is filled with prophecies. There are countless prophecies in Scripture, and there are hundreds in Revelation alone. And never once is the fulfillment formula, this was to fulfill what the prophet spoke. You never see that accompanying a single prophecy in Revelation, much less the fulfillment of a prophecy that occurred 25 years prior to the writing of this book. Argument number 3 is that John mentions the Jewish temple as being intact in Revelation 11, 1 and 2. We read in Revelation 11, "Then I was given a measuring rod like a staff, and I was told, Rise and measure the temple of God and the altar and those who worship there. But do not measure the court outside the temple. Leave that out, for it is given over to the nations, and they will trample the holy city for 42 months. So the idea here is that the temple being described in Revelation 11 is the very temple that was destroyed in AD 70. Therefore, John's writing must predate the temple's destruction. Here's my response to that argument. First of all, it is absolutely true that a temple is mentioned in Revelation 11, 1 and 2, as we just read, but that does not require that the original temple be standing at the time of writing. Daniel 9 was written in 538 BC. Ezekiel 40 to 43 was written in 573 BC. Both of those prophets reference a literal temple, and yet at the time of writing for both Daniel and Ezekiel, there is no literal temple still standing. It had been destroyed years prior by the Babylonians. And this is a familiar Old Testament pattern that we see repeated by John in the book of Revelation. Ezekiel was describing not the previous temple, not the original temple built by Solomon, but a future temple that had not yet been built. John is doing the exact same thing. Why would we not expect John to do the same thing that Ezekiel did? We see so many ways in which Revelation mirrors Daniel, mirrors Ezekiel. It is reasonable to understand that John would be referencing a temple that is yet future, that has yet to be built right here. Now, there are a few other arguments out there in addition to the three primary ones that I've discussed. One of them is that preterists often bring up the usage of the words soon and near. The Greek word takos is translated as soon or shortly. The Greek word engus is translated as near or at hand. And the preterists say that those words imply something happening in the immediate aftermath of the writing of Revelation. Therefore, they say that's why these events refer to AD 70. Well, my response to that is that the usage of soon and near occurs at the beginning of Revelation in chapter 1, but also at the end of Revelation in chapter 22. And however you interpret those words, you must be consistent in applying that meaning to all of the events in between those two bookends. There's a lot that transpires there, not just what we would call the tribulation, not just what the preterists would call AD 70, but you've got in there the second coming of Christ, the millennial reign, the great white throne judgment, and the new heavens and new earth. And so you must assume that those events also have been fulfilled in the immediate aftermath of the writing of Revelation. Now, there are full preterists who say that is the case. They see all of that as having been fulfilled, at least in some symbolic fashion, but most preterists would claim to be partial preterists. They hold to the tribulation passages as referring to AD 70, but they still hold to a future fulfillment of Christ's second coming, of his kingdom, perhaps, of the new heavens, the new earth, and of judgment. But that is inconsistent with saying that the usage of soon and near refers to something happening very, very shortly after the writing of Revelation. The futurists' take on those words is that they speak to the imminence of these events. That is the perspective of the early church. We read in 1 John 2:18, it says, "Children, it is the last hour. And as you have heard that Antichrist is coming, so now many Antichrists have come. Therefore, we know that it is the last hour." So to say that these events are soon or near or at hand is to say that they could catch the world off guard at any moment. And we know that that will be the case. Now, because they adhere to the early date, some preterists have felt the pressure to identify the Antichrist or the beast of Revelation 13. They say that refers to Emperor Nero, who would have been ruling at AD 70. They say if you take the Hebrew rendering of his name, Neron Kaiser, and you convert it to its gematria value or its numerical value, it equals 666. This is what is meant, they say, in Revelation 13, 17, and 18, which says, "So that no one can buy or sell unless he has the mark, that is the name of the beast or the number of its name. This calls for wisdom. Let the one who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man, and his number is 666. Now, the problem with this view, and there are many, is that this idea didn't even surface until the 5th century, and it didn't even gain traction until the 1830s with the rise of preterism in Germany. It also uses both a name and a title, whereas Revelation 13 only uses a name. And then there's the fact that it uses Hebrew, Neron Kaiser. That's not the language used in Revelation, so that makes no sense whatsoever. Finally, there are things associated with the beast in Revelation 13 that had nothing to do with Nero as an historical figure. What about the second beast that gives honor to the first beast? What about the image that is supernaturally animated? What about the mark for buying or selling? There are no satisfactory examples in history that speak to fulfillments of those prophecies right there. The church father Irenaeus gives us a final support today for the late date of writing in saying, "We will not, however, incur the risk of pronouncing positively as to the name of Antichrist. For if it were necessary that his name should be distinctly revealed in this present time, it would have been announced by him who beheld the apocalyptic vision. For that was seen not very long time since, but almost in our day, toward the end of Domitian's reign." Now, why do the words of Irenaeus carry so much weight? Well, he was the bishop of Lyon in southern France, but he was born and raised in Smyrna, one of the 7 cities where the 7 churches were to which John wrote at the beginning of Revelation. Not only that, but Irenaeus was a direct disciple of Polycarp, who himself was a direct disciple of John, the author of Revelation. Well, as I said, this has not been an exhaustive discussion, but it's been an interesting one, and I thank you for joining me today. I look forward to more conversation on matters like this. Be sure to subscribe, and have a great day.